I had never minded being alone. In fact, I preferred it. That's why I took the cabin up in the mountains for the winter, away from the noise, away from people. It was supposed to be my retreat, just me, a few books, and the sound of the wind through the pines. The nearest neighbor was miles away, and the isolation was part of the appeal. The first few nights were perfect. The snow fell gently, and the fireplace crackled with warmth. I'd sit there for hours, reading by the fire, completely at peace. The silence was heavy but comforting, like a thick blanket. That silence, though, it began to feel different after a few days. Too thick. Too heavy. Like the world had gone completely still. It started on the fourth night. The wind outside had picked up, howling through the trees, but inside the cabin, everything was calm. I was bundled up on the couch, sipping tea, when I heard it. A creak from the back room. At first, I dismissed it. The cabin was old, and the wind outside could make things shift. But then it came again, louder this time. A deliberate creak, like floorboards groaning under weight. I froze, my heart thudding in my chest. The rational part of me told myself it was just the wind. But another part, an older, deeper part, was screaming that I wasn't alone. I put down my tea, listening intently. For a moment, there was nothing but the wind. Then, a soft shuffle, like something dragging lightly across the wooden floor. I stood up slowly, my pulse hammering in my ears. I hadn't locked the back door, had I? I hadn't even thought to, this far out in the woods. Who could possibly be out here? My breath caught in my throat as I strained to hear. The sound stopped, as if whatever it was knew I was listening. I grabbed the fireplace poker, gripping it tightly as I crept toward the hallway leading to the back room. The shadows seemed darker than they should have been, the hallway stretching out longer than I remembered. I stopped at the entrance to the room, my fingers trembling. I didn't want to look. I didn't want to see what was waiting in the dark. The door to the back room was slightly ajar, a sliver of darkness peeking through. I nudged it open with the poker, holding my breath. The room was empty. My heart pounded in my chest, the relief almost overwhelming. I chuckled nervously to myself, feeling foolish for getting worked up over nothing. And then I saw them. Footprints. In the snow just outside the window, leading up to the back door. Large, human footprints. My stomach twisted. I slowly turned to look at the door. It was unlocked, but there were no footprints leaving. The realization hit me like ice water down my spine. Whoever or whatever had made those tracks had come in, but hadn't left. My breath came in shallow, panicked gasps as I backed away from the door. My mind raced, trying to rationalize it, but the fear had rooted itself too deep. I had locked the door, bolted it this time, but the feeling that I wasn't alone lingered, pressing down on me from every corner of the cabin. I sat in the living room, poker still in hand, the fire burning low. Hours passed. I kept glancing at the hallway, expecting something to emerge from the shadows. Every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind outside set my nerves on edge. The storm had worsened outside, the wind howling louder and louder, but inside it was eerily quiet. Too quiet. And then, a knock. A soft, deliberate knock on the front door. I froze. It couldn't have been the wind. This was too rhythmic, too purposeful. I stood slowly, staring at the door, my heart racing. Another knock. Louder this time. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. Whoever or whatever was outside, I didn't want to meet them. The knocking stopped, but the silence that followed was worse. The air felt thick, like something was watching me, waiting. I slowly backed away from the door, retreating toward the bedroom. I didn't take my eyes off it, listening for any sound. That's when I heard it. A soft scraping, from above. The cabin had no attic. There was no reason for anything to be moving up there. My blood turned to ice. The scraping continued, slow and deliberate, like something was dragging itself across the ceiling. I didn't wait. I grabbed my coat, my boots, and bolted for the back door. I didn't care about the storm. I didn't care about the cold. I just had to get out. The snow hit me like a wall as I stumbled outside, my breath coming in ragged gasps, but I didn't stop. I ran blindly, through the snow, the cabin shrinking behind me. I never went back. I don't know what was in that cabin with me that night, but I know I wasn't alone. Something was watching. Something was waiting. And it still is. It was a brutal winter, one of those nights where the cold seeps into your bones no matter how many layers you wear. The roads were slick with ice, and the snow fell steadily, almost hypnotically, blanketing everything in sight. I'd just finished a long shift at the hospital and was eager to get home, but I had to drive through the forested back roads. It was quicker, though everyone said it was a bad idea during winter storms. Still, I wasn't about to stay the night in that godforsaken place. My headlights barely pierced through the swirling snow as I inched forward, the tires slipping slightly even though I was driving slower than usual. The trees were tall and gnarled, their black branches reaching out like skeletal hands trying to grab me as I passed. There was no one else on the road. It felt like I was the only person left in the world, swallowed by the night and the storm. About halfway through the forest, my car sputtered. The lights flickered, and the engine died. Just like that, I was stranded. I sat there for a moment, trying to calm myself, staring out into the blinding white void. My breath fogged up the inside of the windshield as I fumbled for my phone. No signal, of course. My heart pounded in my chest as I realized how isolated I truly was. I decided to wait a while, hoping the storm would pass or a snowplow would come by. Minutes ticked by, and the storm only grew worse. The wind howled like a wounded animal, rattling the car as if something was trying to get in. I pulled my coat tighter around me, feeling the chill creep in through the cracks in the door. Suddenly, through the fogged-up window, I saw movement. Just a flicker of something dark against the snow. My heart leapt. Maybe someone was out there, another stranded driver or a local. I squinted through the glass, wiping away the fog with my hand. There it was again, a figure, just at the edge of the woods. But something was wrong. The way it moved, slow and deliberate, like it was floating more than walking. I couldn't make out much in the darkness, but I could see its eyes, glowing faintly, 2 pinpricks of light in the distance. My breath caught in my throat. I told myself it was just a trick of the light, some reflection in the snow. But then the figure moved closer. It was tall, impossibly tall, its body elongated and twisted, like it didn't fit right in its skin. As it came closer, I could see its face, or rather the absence of one. It was blank, featureless, like a mannequin made of shadow. Panic surged through me. I locked the doors, my hands shaking uncontrollably. My breath came in ragged gasps as I watched it approach. It stopped a few feet from the car, standing there in the snow staring, or at least I imagined it was staring, through the windshield. I could feel its presence, heavy and oppressive, pressing down on me like the weight of the storm itself. My entire body screamed at me to move, to run, but I was frozen, paralyzed by fear. The figure tilted its head slightly, as if curious, and then it did something that made my blood run cold. It smiled. There were no lips, no mouth, but I felt it smile. A horrible, knowing grin that stretched across the darkness where its face should have been. The air in the car grew impossibly cold, colder than the storm outside. My breath turned to ice in front of me, and I could barely move my fingers. I don't know how long we stared at each other. Seconds, minutes, hours? Time seemed to stretch and warp in that moment. Then, as suddenly as it appeared, the figure vanished. One moment it was there, looming over me, and the next it was gone, swallowed by the storm. I didn't dare move. I couldn't. I sat there, gripping the steering wheel, my knuckles white, until the storm finally began to let up. When dawn broke, a faint light filtering through the thinning clouds, I forced myself to move. My car sputtered back to life on the first try, and I floored it, driving like a madman until I reached the safety of the highway. Even now, I can't shake the feeling that something was out there that night, something that wasn't human. I still drive those roads sometimes, but never at night, and never in the winter, because I know it's still out there waiting. The cabin I'd rented was perfect, small, cozy, and perched on the edge of a frozen lake deep in the wilderness. It was the kind of place where you could get lost, in a good way, far from the stress of daily life. I had planned a week of solitude, just me and the snow-covered landscape. No internet, no phone calls, just pure silence. The first couple of days were everything I'd hoped for. I spent hours by the fire, reading and watching the snow fall gently outside the large window that faced the lake. At night, the stillness was almost eerie, but I enjoyed the isolation. It was peaceful. Then, on the third night, the feeling changed. It was just after midnight, and I was lying in bed, listening to the wind batter the walls. The night was darker than any I'd ever experienced. Even the moonlight seemed to get swallowed by the clouds overhead. I should have felt safe in the warmth of the cabin, but instead, an unsettling awareness crept over me. It was the feeling you get when you know someone is watching. At first, I thought it was just paranoia. I'd been alone for days, and maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. I rolled over and closed my eyes, determined to fall asleep. That's when I heard it, the faintest tap on the window. I froze. The tap came again. Soft, barely audible, but enough to send a chill up my spine. I forced myself to sit up, my heart pounding. It was probably just the wind, I told myself. Snow, maybe, brushing against the glass. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there. The window faced the lake, about 20 feet from the edge of the trees. Anyone or anything out there would be standing in a thick layer of snow, and I hadn't heard footsteps or seen anyone since arriving. I hesitated before getting out of bed, my breath shallow, and walked to the window. I peered out through the frost-coated glass. At first, I saw nothing, just the reflection of my pale face and the swirling snow beyond. But as my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I noticed something. There in the shadows, just beyond the edge of the trees, stood a figure. It was barely visible, blending into the darkness, but it was there. Tall, motionless, watching. My breath hitched as I stared, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. It was too far to make out any features, just a dark silhouette against the snow. I stepped back, my heart racing. My first instinct was to dismiss it. Maybe it was a tree, or a trick of the light. But deep down, I knew better. I grabbed my flashlight from the bedside table, and in a moment of courage, or maybe stupidity, I flicked it on and pointed it at the window. The light cut through the darkness, illuminating the snow-covered ground, but the figure was gone. I scanned the area, but there was no sign of anyone. I let out a shaky breath, convincing myself it had been my imagination. I turned off the light, but the unease lingered. I left the flashlight on the bed and climbed back under the covers, pulling them up to my chin. Sleep didn't come easily. Every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind had me on edge. I kept glancing at the window, half expecting to see that figure again. But the hours passed, and nothing happened. Eventually, exhaustion overtook me, and I drifted off. When I woke the next morning, the sun was barely peeking over the horizon. I sat up, rubbing the sleep from my eyes, and glanced at the window again. The snow was still falling lightly, and everything seemed normal. I felt a bit foolish for getting so worked up the night before. But then I saw them, footprints. They led from the edge of the forest, right up to the window. I jumped out of bed, my pulse quickening as I moved closer to the glass. The prints were large, human-sized, and unmistakable. They ended just beneath the window, as if someone had stood there, looking in. The snow was still undisturbed around the cabin, which meant they hadn't been there long. I would have heard if someone had walked away. I rushed to the front door, yanking it open, the freezing air biting at my skin. I followed the tracks with my eyes, but they stopped abruptly a few feet from the cabin. No trail led back into the woods, no sign of anyone leaving. It was as if the figure had just vanished. I slammed the door shut, locking it behind me. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. How could there be footprints leading to the cabin but none leaving? The rest of the day passed in a blur of paranoia. I kept the curtains drawn, the doors locked, jumping at every sound. I wanted to leave, but the storm had worsened, and there was no way my car would make it down the mountain in this weather. By nightfall, the feeling of being watched had returned, stronger than before. I couldn't shake the thought that whoever or whatever had stood outside my window was still out there waiting. As the night wore on, I sat in the living room, every light in the cabin on. The wind howled louder than ever, rattling the windows. I stared at the drawn curtains, too afraid to open them, too afraid to look outside. And then I heard it again. The soft, deliberate tap on the window. This time, I didn't look. I couldn't. I just sat there, frozen, as the tapping continued, slow and rhythmic. Something was out there, just beyond the glass, waiting for me to acknowledge it. But I never did. I never looked again.